Picture a city of Americans, more than 600,000 of them, more people than live in the entire state of Wyoming. They pay federal income tax, the same as everyone listening to this. They serve in the armed forces. They have fought and died in every war the country has ever fought. And yet for the first century and a half of the Republic, not one of them could cast a single vote for President of the United States. Not because they were too young, not because they had lost the right through some crime, not because they failed a literacy test at the door of the polling place. They were barred for one reason and one reason only: where they lived. They lived in Washington, in the district, and the district under the Constitution is not a state. This is Do It for the Case Law. Doctrine Deep Dive Season 0. The amendments, one at a time, one sharpest gap each. Today, the 23rd. Congress finally moved to fix that in 1961. It amended the Constitution to give the district a vote for president. A clean victory, you would think. One more group of Americans brought inside the tent. But read the amendment closely, slowly, and you find something odd sitting right beside the grant. A cap. The very sentence that hands the district its electors also writes a ceiling directly over them. And about the other half of the disenfranchisement, the fact that these same Americans had, and still have, no voting member of Congress, the amendment says nothing at all. So here's the question for this primer. Residents of the district can vote for president, but the amendment that granted that right also capped it. What did the 23rd Amendment give them, and what did it deliberately withhold? Start with why anyone needed an amendment at all. Why a mere statute, an ordinary act of Congress, could not simply hand the district a vote. When the framers designed the seat of government, they made a deliberate choice. The capital would belong to no state. Article 1 of the Constitution gives Congress exclusive authority over the district, a federal enclave under the national legislature, set up that way precisely so that no single state could hold the nation's capital, and the federal government sitting inside it under its own thumb. The worry was concrete rather than theoretical. During the Revolution, a mob of unpaid soldiers had surrounded the Congress in Philadelphia, and Pennsylvania declined to send its militia to disperse them. The Congress had to leave the city. A capital that depended on a host state for its own protection had already failed once. That solved a real problem. But it created another one quietly, and it took a long time for the country to feel it. The entire machinery for electing a president runs through the states. The Electoral College is built out of electors appointed by each state, and the number each state receives is tied to its seats in Congress. If you are not in a state, there is simply no slot for you in that machine. And the district is not a state. So for 150 years, the people of the capital city, the city named for the first president, the place from which the whole government was run, had no electors, and therefore no voice at all in choosing who would lead it. The seat of the government was the one place in America with no say in who ran it. By the middle of the 20th century, that was getting hard to say out loud. The district was no longer a small federal outpost of clerks and cabinet officers. It was a full city with hundreds of thousands of permanent residents, more people than lived in several actual states. They were taxed like other Americans and drafted like other Americans, and every 4 years they watched the rest of the country choose a president while they stood on the outside of the process looking in. The barrier was written into the Constitution itself, into the very definition of how the Electoral College counts. Congress could not legislate around it, only a constitutional amendment could move it. And there is one more feature of the mid-century district worth naming plainly, because it shaped the politics. By this period, the city had a very large black population, and the disenfranchisement of the capital was, in practice, the disenfranchisement of a majority black city. The amendment arrived in 1961, ratified on the 29th of March. Its effect, as the federal courts have since described it, was to give residents of the district the right to appoint electors for the election of the President and Vice President of the United States. And so for the first time in the nation's history in the presidential election of 1964, ballots cast in Washington counted toward the result. It is worth pausing on how fast that went. The amendment was proposed in June of 1960 and ratified the following March. 9 months. That is among the quickest ratifications in American history, faster than almost anything else in this season. Which tells you the proposition itself was not controversial. Very few people were prepared to argue in public that the residents of the capital should have no say in choosing the president. What was controversial was everything the amendment left out. Now notice how carefully the amendment does its work, because the care is the whole story. It does not make the district a state. It does not disturb the Electoral College's basic rule that electors come from states. Instead, it borrows that machinery for one narrow specific purpose: The text says the district shall appoint a number of electors equal to the whole number of senators and representatives in Congress to which the district would be entitled if it were a state. If it were a state. Read that phrase and hear what it is doing. It treats the district as if it were a state, but only for the single job of choosing presidential electors, and only through a legal fiction that lasts exactly as long as that one clause and not a syllable longer. Outside that clause, the district is what it always was, not a state. And the amendment is meticulous about keeping that fiction contained. Its own text says these electors shall be in addition to those appointed by the states, that they shall be considered, for the purposes of the election of president and vice president, to be electors appointed by a state, and that they shall meet in the district and follow the same procedure the 12th Amendment lays out for everyone else. Every clause points inward toward that one function. Notice the phrasing in the middle one especially. Considered to be electors appointed by a state, not are considered to be for these purposes. The drafters chose language that performs the fiction and simultaneously announces that it is one. The district is welcomed into the presidential election and by the very same words walled off from everything beyond it.
Grant carries its own ceiling built right into the text that gives it, that as if a state language would, standing alone, give the district electors based on its population, 2 for the senators it would have, plus 1 for each representative its numbers would earn. But the sentence does not stop at the as-if calculation. It keeps going, and it adds a handful of words that change everything. But in no event more than the least populous state. In no event more. That is the cap. Whatever the as-if math would produce, the district can never receive more electoral votes than the smallest state in the Union. And the smallest state, always, has exactly 3. 2 senators and, at the constitutional minimum, 1 representative. So the district's number is not merely small, it is frozen.
It received 3 electoral votes in 1964. It has 3 today. And if its population doubled next year, it would still, by the plain command of the Constitution, have 3. Sit with that as a design choice because it is a strange one. Every actual state's weight in the Electoral College floats with its people. A state grows and it gains electors at the next census. It shrinks and it loses them. That responsiveness is the whole point of tying electors to representation. The district's weight cannot float. It was handed a vote and in the same breath told the vote would never grow, however many Americans came to live there. It is the only place in the country whose share of the Electoral College is fixed as a hard number in the constitutional text itself rather than earned and re-earned by its population every 10 years. And there is a detail in the cap that makes it sharper still. The ceiling is not a fixed 3, it is whatever the least populous state has, so the district's presidential weight is determined by the population of an entirely different place, one it has no connection to and no influence over. If the smallest state grew enough to earn a second representative, the district would gain an elector, having done nothing. If a smaller state were admitted, the district could lose one. That is a genuinely unusual constitutional arrangement. A political community's voice in choosing the president is indexed to the census results of a state on the other side of the country. The vote is real. It is also permanently capped, and capped by reference to something the district cannot affect. And then there is the larger silence. The thing the amendment does not mention at all. The 23rd is about the presidency and only the presidency. It gave the district electors for choosing a president. It did not give the district a single voting member of the House or a single senator, and it did not pretend to. That omission was not an accident that slipped past the drafters, it was deliberate, and it is on the record. The congressional report accompanying the amendment stated, in words that federal courts would later quote back, that it would not authorize the district to have representation in the Senate or the House of Representatives. They knew precisely what they were leaving out, and they wrote it down. That sentence exists because someone wanted to foreclose the argument before it was ever made. 9 years later, Congress offered a partial consolation. In 1970, it authorized residents of the district to elect a non-voting delegate to the House of Representatives, a delegate who can sit on committees, speak on the floor, and introduce legislation, but who cannot vote on whether any of it becomes law. A voice in the room and no vote in the count. And notice what that arrangement demonstrates. Congress could create the delegate by ordinary statute, because a delegate is not a representative in the constitutional sense. The moment you want an actual vote, you are back to needing a state or an amendment. The delegate is not a step toward representation. It is a demonstration of exactly where the statutory road ends. The representation question did not stay a matter of speeches and license plates. It went to court directly. In the year 2000, a group of district residents sued the federal government, and their argument was ambitious. They did not ask Congress for a new amendment. They said the Constitution, read correctly, already entitled them to voting representation in Congress, that the district should be counted as a state for the purpose of apportioning seats in the House, and that its long exclusion had been the mistake all along. The case is Adams versus Clinton. Because it challenged the constitutionality of that exclusion, it was heard by a special three-judge federal court sitting in the District of Columbia. And the plaintiffs conceded the thing that decided it. They did not dispute that to succeed, they had to be able to characterize themselves as residents of a state. The court rejected the claim, and it did so in language worth hearing in full. Quoting the court directly, "We conclude that constitutional text, history, and judicial precedent bar us from accepting plaintiffs' contention that the District of Columbia may be considered a state for purposes of congressional representation under Article I. Not a state for that purpose." The judges worked through the text of Article I, through the history of how and why the district was created, and through a line of older Supreme Court decisions, and they found every one of those sources pointing the same direction. And they took up the 23rd Amendment head-on, because the plaintiffs had tried to turn it into a sword. If the Constitution can treat the district as if a state to hand it presidential electors, they argued, why not for Congress as well? The court's answer was that the amendment cut the other way. Its own drafters had said in plain terms that it would not authorize the district to have representation in the Senate or the House of Representatives. The very existence of the 23rd became evidence against the broader claim. If the as-if fiction were generally available, the argument runs, the amendment would not have been necessary in the first place. The country amended the Constitution to give the district presidential electors precisely because it could not get them any other way. That is an uncomfortable feature of partial fixes. Solving one piece of a problem can harden the rest of it. The 23rd did not merely fail to address congressional representation, it became a reason to deny it. The court was thorough about the rest of it, too. The plaintiffs had not rested on a single theory. They argued that shutting the district out denied them equal protection, stripped them of the privileges of national citizenship, took their liberty without due process, and betrayed the Constitution's guarantee of a Republican form of government. The court answered all of it at once. Quoting again, "The denial of representation does not deny them equal protection, abridge their privileges or immunities, deprive them of liberty without due process, or violate the guarantee of a Republican form of government." One after another, every constitutional handhold the plaintiffs reached for came away in their hands. And the Supreme Court then summarily affirmed, without full argument and without a written opinion of its own. But there is a detail in that decision the tidy version leaves out, and it matters. The panel was not unanimous. The opinion came accompanied by a partial dissent, described by a later court as similarly thoughtful. So even in the decision that closed the door, one judge was writing separately to say that at least part of the majority's reasoning was wrong. That is worth knowing because of how these things get described afterward. When a claim loses and the Supreme Court affirms without comment, the shorthand becomes settled. But a summary affirmance is not a reasoned endorsement. It resolves the case. It does not necessarily bless every step of the analysis, and it certainly does not answer the dissent. And the question did not stop being litigated in the year 2000, which is where most accounts of this leave it. 20 years later, another set of district residents brought essentially the same challenge, and another three-judge panel of the same court took it up. That case is Castanon versus United States, decided in 2020. The plaintiffs framed their claims somewhat differently, leaning on equal protection, due process, and rights of association and representation. The court described the case as a close cousin of the suit litigated a generation earlier, said that neither it nor the parties wrote on a blank slate, and followed the earlier decision. The claims failed again, and challenges have continued to be filed since. The courthouse door has been tried repeatedly. It has not opened. So here is the thesis, and it is a precise one. The 23rd Amendment is a study in half measures. Set it next to the promise that a word like enfranchisement usually carries a full and equal voice, and you can measure exactly how much of that promise it holds back even in the act of granting. It gave the district a real vote for president. That vote is cast every 4 years, and it counts. In a close election, it could decide the outcome. But it did 3 separate things that keep that vote from ever adding up to equal citizenship. And each of them was a choice, made deliberately by people who understood what they were doing. First, it capped the district's presidential weight at the level of the smallest state and carved that ceiling into the Constitution, so the vote can never grow with the population the way every state's vote does. Second, it refused to make the district a state, reaching instead for an as-if fiction that expires at the end of a single clause and that later became an argument against extending the same fiction anywhere else. And third, it said nothing whatsoever about Congress, leaving more than 500,000 Americans with no senator and no voting representative. A silence, remember, that the drafters chose on purpose and wrote down in the record so that nobody could later argue otherwise. 3 choices, each one narrowing what the amendment could ever become. That is the distance between the words and the structure. The words grant the vote. The structure withholds equal weight and withholds representation altogether. A person living in the district today can help choose the single most powerful office on earth, and in the same moment carries less weight in the electoral college than they would in the emptiest state in the country, and has no vote at all in the body that writes the nation's laws and levies its taxes. The protection the amendment offers does not track the principle of equal citizenship. It tracks a narrow political compromise struck in 1961. Fix the most visible, most embarrassing piece of the disenfranchisement, the missing presidential vote, and leave everything else exactly where it sat. And leaving everything else where it sat is precisely what keeps this alive. The fight over the district's representation did not end in 1961. It did not end in 1970 with the non-voting delegate. It did not end in the year 2000 when the constitutional argument was rejected, and it did not end 20 years after that when the same argument was rejected again. It runs straight into the present through statehood proposals that would dissolve the whole problem by simply making the district a state. Through the license plates on the cars in Washington that read taxation without representation. Through every census that adds residents whose share of the presidential vote stays frozen. And there is a serious argument that the 23rd made the larger fix harder rather than easier. It is worth setting the district beside the territories for a moment because the comparison reframes the whole thing. Puerto Rico has roughly 3 million residents. They are United States citizens. Guam, the Virgin Islands, American Samoa, the Northern Marianas all have permanent populations of citizens or nationals. None of them can vote for president. There is no 23rd Amendment for any of them. Each sends a non-voting delegate or resident commissioner to the House, and that is the whole of it. So the district is not the worst case. It is the one place outside the states that got a constitutional fix at all, which raises an obvious question: why the district and not the others? And the honest answer is not principle. It is proximity and visibility. The capital's disenfranchisement was happening in front of Congress every day in the city where Congress worked. The mechanics of that argument are worth understanding because they are genuinely awkward. Suppose the district became a state tomorrow. The 23rd Amendment would still be sitting in the Constitution, still awarding electors to the seat of government, which under most statehood proposals would remain a small federal district containing the Capitol, the White House, and the monuments. A handful of people live in that area. Under the unrepealed text, they would be entitled to 3 electoral votes of their own. So statehood without repeal produces an absurdity, and repeal requires its own amendment. The provision meant to reduce the district's disenfranchisement is now a procedural obstacle to ending it. That is the sharpest thing in the 23rd. An amendment that enfranchised the district just precisely enough to make its continuing disenfranchisement constitutional, and just awkwardly enough to complicate the cure. That comparison also tells you something about how the cap got written. Giving the district electors in proportion to its population would have made it, in that era, a mid-sized state in the Electoral College. Capping it at 3 made it the smallest possible participant. The difference between those two options is the difference between admitting a new political community to the system and admitting it on terms that guarantee it can never matter much. And the votes were understood at the time to be reliably one-sided in a way that made the calculation obvious to everyone involved. So the cap is not a drafting quirk or an act of caution about an unusual jurisdiction. It is the price that was charged for the grant, and it was charged in the same sentence. There is a broader lesson here that reaches past this one amendment. We tend to treat partial reform as unambiguously good. Some progress is better than none. Get what you can now, come back for the rest later. This amendment is a case study in why that instinct deserves scrutiny. The partial fix relieved the pressure that might have produced a complete one. It supplied an answer to the most embarrassing version of the question, which made the remaining injustice easier to live with. It generated a record of deliberate omission that courts have used for 60 years to reject the broader claim. And it wrote a structure into the Constitution that now has to be removed before the full remedy can work. None of which means the residents of the district should have kept waiting for a better deal. It means the cost of a half measure is not zero, and it is usually paid later by someone else. That is the sample. A full Amendment 23 season on this show would take each of these pieces in turn. The century and a half before the fix, when the residents of the Capitol had no presidential vote at all. The elector formula and the cap written into its own sentence. The 1970 delegate with a voice and no vote. The statehood and representation fights that are still running today, including the interaction between statehood and the unrepealed text, and the case law that has tested this gap in court, from the first three-judge panel through the second one a generation later, and the partial dissent that has never quite been answered. One doctrinal question per episode, each one anchored in sources we verify, not sources we remember. A quick word on how this show works. Everything you just heard is legal education, not legal advice. We are teaching how the Constitution's machinery actually moves, not telling anyone what to do in a case of their own. And all of it is built on real, checkable sources. The text of the 23rd Amendment itself, the documented history of the district's long road to a presidential vote, and two real, named, verified decisions of the federal court in the District of Columbia, both pulled from the court's own opinions before I wrote a single word. Every citation is waiting in the show notes. That is the whole ethos, and it is the name of the show. Do it for the case law. I'll see you at the next amendment.